Welcome to Go Reading Bedtime Stories presented by GoReadling.com. Personalized education and reading skills for kids. Find a comfortable spot, close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath, and let our story carry you gently off to sleep. Tonight's story is called Jack and the Beanstalk. Once upon a time, in a small village nestled between green rolling hills and a winding silver river, there lived a boy named Jack and his mother. They were very poor. Their cottage was tiny, with a thatched roof that leaked when it rained and walls that let the cold wind whistle through in winter. They had a small garden where Jack's mother grew cabbages and potatoes, and they had one cow, a gentle old dairy cow named Milky White, who had been with them for as long as Jack could remember. Milky White had soft brown eyes, a warm muzzle, and a patient, plodding way of walking that made Jack smile. Every morning, Jack would take Milky White to the meadow to graze, and every evening his mother would milk her. The milk was their most precious resource. Jack's mother would make butter and cheese from it and sell them at the village market to buy bread, flour, and the few other things they needed. It was a hard life, but Jack and his mother loved each other dearly, and they made the best of what they had. Jack's mother would tell him stories by the fire at night, tales of kings and castles and great adventures, and Jack would listen with wide eyes, dreaming of a life beyond the little village and the green hills. Jack was a good-hearted boy, cheerful and willing to help, but he had a habit of daydreaming. He would sit in the meadow with Milky White, chewing on a blade of grass, staring up at the clouds and imagining the shapes he saw. There were dragons and ships and faraway mountains. He would forget to gather the firewood his mother asked for. He would wander down to the river to watch the fish instead of weeding the garden. He meant well, but his mind was always somewhere else, somewhere high above the ordinary world, among the clouds. His mother would shake her head and sigh. "Jack, you are a dreamer," she would say, not unkindly. "Dreams are fine, but we also need firewood and weeded cabbages." Jack would apologize and hurry to do his chores, feeling guilty. But by the next afternoon, he would be back in the meadow, cloud-gazing again. The villagers called him Jack the Dreamer, and some of them shook their heads, but others smiled, because there was something about Jack's wide-eyed wonder at the world that was impossible not to like. But one sad day, Milky White stopped giving milk. She was old, far older than most dairy cows, and her milking days were simply over. She still followed Jack to the meadow each morning and stood beside him while he watched the clouds. But no matter how gently Jack's mother tried, not a drop of milk came. Without milk, there was no butter and no cheese. Without butter and cheese, there was nothing to sell at market. Without market money, there was no flour for bread. The last coins in the jar on the mantelpiece were spent, and the cupboard grew emptier and emptier until there was nothing left but half a loaf of stale bread and a few wrinkled potatoes. Jack's mother sat at the kitchen table one evening and put her head in her hands. "Jack," she said, her voice heavy with sadness, "I am afraid we must sell Milky White. She is all we have left. Take her to market tomorrow and get the best price you can. We need the money to buy food, or we will go hungry." Jack felt a lump in his throat. Milky White was more than a cow to him. She was a friend. But he could see the worry in his mother's eyes, and he nodded bravely. "I will get a good price, Mother. I promise." The next morning, Jack set out early with Milky White. The road to market wound through the village, past the baker's shop that smelled of fresh bread, past the blacksmith's forge where sparks flew like tiny orange stars, past the duck pond where the ducks paddled in lazy circles, and out into the open countryside. The sun was warm, the hedgerows were full of singing birds, and the wildflowers along the road nodded in the breeze. Despite his heavy heart, Jack could not help but notice how beautiful the world was. Milky White walked beside him, her hooves clip-clopping on the dirt road, her big brown eyes calm and trusting. They had not gone far when they met a strange old man sitting on a stone wall by the roadside. He was small and wrinkled, with a pointed hat, bright twinkling eyes, and a long coat covered in patches of every color. He was holding something in his cupped hands, peering at it with intense interest.
"Good morning, young man," the stranger said cheerfully. "And where might you be going with that fine cow?" Jack explained that he was taking Milky White to market to sell her. The old man examined the cow with a knowing eye and nodded. "She is a good cow, loyal, kind. I can see it in her eyes." Then the old man leaned forward and opened his cupped hands. In his palms lay 5 beans. They were not ordinary beans. They shimmered and glowed with faint colors, one red, one blue, one green, one gold, and one that seemed to change color depending on how the light hit it. "I will trade you these beans for your cow," the old man said. Jack almost laughed. "Beans? For a cow? My mother would be furious." The old man's eyes twinkled. "These are not ordinary beans, my boy. They are magic beans. Plant them tonight, and by morning, something extraordinary will have happened. I give you my word." Jack looked at the beans. They really were beautiful, almost alive with light. He looked at Milky White. He looked back at the beans. Something in the old man's voice, something honest and certain, made Jack believe him. Against all common sense, he made the trade. When Jack arrived home without Milky White and without money, but with 5 beans in his pocket, his mother's face went from hopeful to confused to furious in the space of 3 seconds. "Beans?" she cried. "You traded our only cow for 5 beans? Oh, Jack, what were you thinking? We cannot eat magic beans. We cannot pay the rent with magic beans. We needed that money for food." Tears of frustration rolled down her cheeks. Jack felt terrible. Standing in the kitchen with his mother crying, the magic beans suddenly seemed very foolish indeed. His mother snatched the beans from his hand and threw them out the open window in anger. They sailed through the air and landed in the soft earth of the garden. "Go to bed, Jack," his mother said wearily. "There is nothing for supper tonight." Jack climbed the narrow stairs to his little room under the eaves, lay down on his straw mattress, and stared up at the ceiling. He could hear his mother crying softly downstairs, and the sound broke his heart. He had never felt so useless and foolish in all his life. Eventually, he fell into a troubled, restless sleep. When Jack woke the next morning, something was different. His room was darker than usual, as if something was blocking the window. He rubbed his eyes and looked. Where yesterday there had been a view of the garden and the green hills beyond, now there was only green, a wall of thick, twisting green stems and enormous leaves. Jack threw open his window and gasped. Growing from the very spot where his mother had thrown the beans was the most enormous plant he had ever seen. It was not a plant, really. It was a beanstalk, a gigantic, twisting, spiraling beanstalk as thick as a great oak tree at its base, with a trunk of intertwined green stems that wound around each other like a living rope. It rose up from the garden, past the cottage roof, past the treetops, past the highest point Jack had ever seen, up and up and up, disappearing through the clouds into the sky above. The leaves were as big as dinner tables. The tendrils were as thick as Jack's arm. Morning dew clung to every surface, making the whole beanstalk glitter and sparkle in the early light, like a tower of emeralds touching the sky.
Jack stared at the beanstalk for a long time, his mouth hanging open. Then a grin spread across his face, wider and wider, until he was smiling so hard his cheeks hurt. "The old man was right," he whispered. "They really were magic beans." He pulled on his shoes, ran downstairs, and burst out the front door. His mother was already standing in the garden, looking up at the beanstalk with an expression that was equal parts amazement and alarm. "Jack," she said slowly, "what on earth has happened to my cabbage patch?" Jack looked up at the beanstalk, its great green column rising endlessly into the clouds above. His heart was pounding with excitement. The dreamer in him, the boy who watched clouds and imagined dragons, was already thinking one clear, irresistible thought. "I have to climb it. I have to see what is at the top." "Mother," he said, trying to sound calm and responsible, "I am going to climb the beanstalk." His mother grabbed his arm. "Absolutely not! It could be dangerous. We do not know what is up there." But Jack gently took her hand. "We have no food and no money," he said quietly. "Whatever is up there, it cannot be worse than what is down here. Let me try, please." His mother looked into his eyes and saw something she had not seen before. Not a dreamer, but a young man ready to be brave. She hugged him tightly. "Be careful, Jack. Promise me." "I promise," he said. Jack began to climb. The beanstalk was surprisingly easy to scale, its thick stems and broad leaves forming a natural ladder of handholds and footholds. He climbed past the cottage roof and looked down at his mother, who was shading her eyes and watching him anxiously. He waved. She waved back. He kept climbing. He climbed past the treetops where the birds flew and sang, startled by this boy ascending through their territory. He climbed through a layer of cool, damp mist that clung to his skin and clothes. He climbed until the village below was just a tiny patchwork of green fields and brown rooftops, the river a thin silver thread, the people too small to see. The air grew thinner and cooler, and the wind tugged at his hair and clothes. Still he climbed. His arms ached and his fingers were stiff, but he did not stop. He was Jack the Dreamer, and he was climbing into the sky, into the clouds, into the unknown. And then, suddenly, he pushed through the top of a cloud bank and found himself in a world he could never have imagined. Above the clouds, everything was different. The sky was a brighter, more vivid blue than Jack had ever seen, and the clouds below him formed a vast, white, rolling landscape that looked like snow-covered hills stretching to the horizon in every direction. But there was solid ground here, too, a great expanse of gray-brown earth and rock, as if an entire land had been lifted up and placed on top of the world. The air was clear and cold and sparkled with a faint golden light, and there, looming against the sky in the distance, was an enormous castle. It was the biggest building Jack had ever seen, or could ever have imagined. Its walls were made of dark gray stone, its towers reached toward the upper sky, and a massive wooden drawbridge spanned a moat of swirling cloud. Everything about it was vast, the doorways, the windows, the stones in the walls. It was a castle built for someone much, much larger than Jack. He swallowed hard. His legs felt shaky, and a small, sensible voice in his head said, "Turn around. Go back down. This is too dangerous." But another voice, the dreamer's voice, whispered, "You did not climb all this way to turn back." Jack took a deep breath and walked toward the castle. The drawbridge was down, and Jack crossed it carefully, his footsteps echoing on the massive wooden planks. Each plank was wider than his entire body. He passed through the castle gates, which towered above him like the entrance to a cathedral, and found himself in an enormous hallway. The ceiling was so high it disappeared into shadow. Torches as big as tree trunks flickered on the walls, casting dancing orange light. The floor was made of stone slabs, each one the size of Jack's entire garden. Everything was giant-sized. The doors, the furniture he could see through open archways, the tapestries on the walls showing hunting scenes with riders as tall as buildings. Jack crept along the edge of the hallway, feeling very small and very alone. Then he heard a sound that made his blood freeze. Footsteps. Enormous, thundering footsteps that shook the floor and made the torches flicker. Someone was coming. Someone very, very large. Jack looked around desperately for a place to hide and spotted a massive copper pot sitting against the wall. It was the size of a small room. He scrambled behind it just as the footsteps grew deafening. A shadow fell across the hallway, and then Jack saw him. A giant. An actual giant. He was as tall as a house, with arms like tree trunks, legs like pillars, and a great craggy face with a broad nose and small, sharp eyes that peered out from under thick, bristly eyebrows. He wore a leather tunic and enormous boots that thudded on the stone floor. As he walked, the giant sniffed the air. "Fee, fi, fo, fum," the giant rumbled in a voice like distant thunder. "I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead, I will grind his bones to make my bread." Jack pressed himself against the copper pot, his heart hammering so loud he was sure the giant could hear it. But the giant sniffed a few more times, shrugged his enormous shoulders, and lumbered past, disappearing through a doorway at the far end of the hall. Jack let out his breath in a long, shaky whoosh. Jack waited until the giant's footsteps faded, then crept out from behind the pot and tiptoed through the castle. He peeked through doorways into enormous rooms. A kitchen where pots the size of bathtubs hung from hooks. A dining hall with a table so long Jack could not see the end of it. A pantry stacked with wheels of cheese as big as cartwheels and loaves of bread the size of boulders. And then he found a room that took his breath away. It was a treasure room. Gold coins were heaped in piles as tall as Jack. Jewels glittered in open chests, rubies and emeralds and sapphires, catching the torchlight and throwing colored sparks across the walls. There were golden cups, golden plates, golden candlesticks, and in the center of the room, on a marble pedestal, sat a small golden hen. Not a real hen, Jack thought at first, but an ornament, exquisitely crafted, every feather detailed in pure gold. But as he crept closer, the hen turned her head and looked at him with bright, intelligent eyes. She was alive. And as Jack watched in astonishment, she ruffed her golden feathers, settled herself on the pedestal, and laid an egg. A golden egg, solid gold, gleaming, heavy with wealth. Jack's eyes went wide. Jack knew he should not steal. His mother had raised him to be honest. But he also thought of his mother's tears, the empty cupboard, the cold cottage with its leaking roof. One golden egg would feed them for months. It would keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. He also considered that the giant did not seem like a particularly kind creature, what with his talk of grinding bones into bread. Jack made a decision. He crept to the pedestal, gently picked up the golden hen, and tucked her under his arm. The hen looked up at him calmly, as if she had been waiting for someone to rescue her. Jack whispered, "I am sorry for taking you, but I think you will be happier with us." Then he turned and ran, as quietly as he could, back through the enormous hallway, out through the castle gates, across the drawbridge, and across the gray landscape to where the beanstalk emerged from the clouds.
He was halfway to the beanstalk when the ground shook. A terrible roar echoed across the skyland. The giant had discovered the hen was missing. Jack heard those thundering footsteps again, closer now, faster. He did not look back. He ran with all his might, the golden hen clutched tightly under one arm, his legs pumping, his lungs burning. He reached the top of the beanstalk and began climbing down as fast as he could, hand over hand, foot over foot, slipping and sliding on the dew-slicked stems. Above him, he heard the giant's furious roar and felt the beanstalk shudder as the giant grabbed the top and began climbing down after him. The beanstalk swayed and groaned under the giant's enormous weight. Jack climbed faster, his fingers aching, his heart pounding. He could hear the giant's labored breathing above him, closer and closer. Jack burst to the cloud layer and could see the ground below, his mother's garden, the tiny cottage, the green fields. He was still high up, terribly high, but the ground was getting closer. "Mother!" he shouted. "Mother, bring the axe!" His mother ran out of the cottage, looked up, saw the beanstalk shaking violently, heard the giant's roar, and understood immediately. She ran to the woodshed and came back with the axe. Jack reached the bottom and leaped to the ground, stumbling and rolling in the cabbage patch. He set the golden hen down safely and grabbed the axe from his mother's hands. The beanstalk was swaying wildly now, the giant's huge boots visible just above the cloud line, descending fast. Jack swung the axe at the base of the beanstalk with all his strength. Chop! The thick green stems shuddered. He swung again. Chop! Fibers snapped and split. One more swing, the mightiest of all. Chop! The beanstalk cracked, groaned, tilted, and then, with a tremendous creaking, tearing sound, it toppled. It fell away from the cottage, crashing across the meadow and into the hills beyond, shaking the ground like an earthquake. The giant, clinging to the upper portion, was carried far, far away, over the hills and beyond the horizon, never to bother anyone in the village again. Jack and his mother stood in the garden, breathing hard, staring at the fallen beanstalk that stretched across the countryside like a great green road. Then they looked at each other, and then they looked at the golden hen, who was sitting calmly on the garden path, preening her golden feathers as if nothing unusual had happened. As they watched, the hen settled herself comfortably, clucked once, and laid a golden egg right there on the path. It gleamed in the morning sunlight. Jack's mother picked it up with trembling hands. It was heavy, solid, and unmistakably real gold. She looked at Jack, and her eyes filled with tears, but not sad tears this time. "Oh, Jack," she whispered, and then she threw her arms around him and held him so tightly he could barely breathe. "My brave, wonderful boy." The golden hen changed everything for Jack and his mother. Every day the hen laid one golden egg, and each egg was worth enough to keep them comfortable for a week. Jack's mother fixed the leaking roof, bought warm blankets for the beds, and filled the cupboard with food. She bought flour for bread, butter for cooking, and fresh vegetables from the market. The cottage, which had been cold and bare for so long, became warm and cheerful. Jack's mother hung new curtains in the windows and planted flowers by the front door. She bought a comfortable rocking chair and sat in it by the fire on winter evenings, knitting and humming and looking happier than Jack had seen her in years. But Jack and his mother were wise. They did not spend extravagantly or show off their wealth. They shared quietly with those in the village who were struggling. A bag of flour left on a neighbor's doorstep, a basket of apples for the widow with 5 children, new shoes for the cobbler's boy who had been wearing his father's old ones, 3 sizes too big. They gave without expecting thanks, because they knew what it felt like to have nothing. The village itself began to change, slowly and quietly, touched by Jack and his mother's generosity.
The baker, who had been struggling to keep his shop open, found a mysterious bag of gold coins on his counter one morning and was able to buy a proper new oven. The school teacher, who had been using a single tattered book shared among all her pupils, arrived one day to find a stack of brand new books sitting on her desk, wrapped in brown paper with no note attached. The old stone bridge over the river, which had been crumbling for years and was dangerous to cross, was repaired by stonemasons who had been hired and paid by someone anonymous. Nobody knew for certain where all this good fortune was coming from, but a few of the older, more observant villagers noticed that Jack's mother always seemed to be smiling these days, and that Jack himself had developed a peculiar habit of whistling cheerfully whenever he walked past a house that had recently received an unexpected bit of help. The village grew warmer and kinder, as if generosity were a seed that, once planted, could not help but grow. Jack also kept his promise to himself about Milky White. He went back to the old man's cottage, which he found one afternoon at the end of a lane he had never noticed before, covered in ivy and morning glories. The old man was sitting on his doorstep, whittling a piece of wood. He looked up and smiled as if he had been expecting Jack. "I came to buy Milky White back," Jack said, holding out a golden egg. The old man shook his head. "Keep your gold, my boy. Milky White has been well cared for. She has been waiting for you." He let Jack around back, and there was Milky White, grazing in a lush green field, looking healthier and happier than she had in years. She saw Jack and mooed softly, plodding over to nuzzle his hand. Jack felt his eyes sting with happy tears. He walked Milky White home that afternoon, and his mother ran out to meet them, wrapping her arms around the old cow's neck. "Welcome home, old friend," she murmured into Milky White's soft ear. Milky White mooed contentedly, as if she had never been away. Spring came to the village in a rush of green and gold, and with it came a warmth that had nothing to do with the weather. Jack's garden was the talk of the countryside. He had planted not just cabbages and potatoes, but rows of sweet peas that climbed the fence in clouds of pink and purple, sunflowers that turned their great golden faces to follow the sun across the sky, and a patch of strawberries that produced berries so sweet and red that the children in the village would come by after school just to see if any were ripe. Jack always had berries to spare. He built a small wooden bench beside the garden gate and set out a basket each morning filled with whatever the garden had produced: berries, tomatoes, bunches of herbs, small bouquets of wildflowers. A little sign beside it said, "Please help yourself." The basket was always empty by evening, and sometimes Jack would find small gifts left in return: a jar of homemade marmalade, a drawing from a child, a bunch of wildflowers picked from the meadow. These small exchanges, given freely and received gratefully, made Jack happier than any amount of gold. As the months passed, Jack changed. The boy who had once been called Jack the Dreamer was still a dreamer. He still watched clouds and imagined dragons. But now he was also Jack the Doer. He worked hard in the garden, which flourished under his care. He helped the carpenter in the village learn to build furniture and discovered he was good with his hands. He read books that his mother bought for him with the egg money, books about faraway lands, about science and nature, about how things worked. He was curious about everything and no longer content to just imagine. He wanted to learn and to build and to make things better. His mother noticed the change and smiled. "The beanstalk did more than give us gold," she told him one evening. "It gave you courage, and courage, Jack, is worth more than all the gold in the world." Jack smiled back and knew she was right. The adventure had taught him that dreams are wonderful, but dreams combined with bravery and action can change the world. Jack never forgot the giant's castle above the clouds. On clear days, he would look up at the sky and wonder about the world that existed up there, vast and strange and full of wonders he had only glimpsed.
He sometimes thought about the giant, too, and felt a twinge of guilt for taking the hen, even though the giant had been fearsome and threatening. He hoped the giant was all right, somewhere beyond the hills, living his own life in his own way. Jack learned from the experience that the world is full of creatures and people very different from ourselves, some frightening, some kind, some both at the same time, and that the best thing you can do is face the unknown with an open heart and a steady nerve. He also learned that coming home is the sweetest part of any adventure, and that the people who love you are the greatest treasure of all, worth more than golden hens and magic beans and castles in the sky. Years went by, and the little cottage at the edge of the village became the most welcoming home in the countryside. The garden overflowed with vegetables and flowers. Milky White lived to a grand old age, spoiled and pampered, grazing in the meadow where Jack had once watched clouds. The golden hen sat on a velvet cushion by the fireplace and laid her daily egg with quiet, dignified regularity. Jack grew into a fine young man, kind and brave and hard-working, who helped everyone in the village and was loved by all. And every evening when the work was done and the sun was setting and the sky turned from gold to rose to deep, soft blue, Jack and his mother would sit on the porch of their little cottage, watching the fireflies come out and listening to the crickets begin their nightly song. They would talk about the day or read to each other, or simply sit together in comfortable silence, grateful for everything they had. The night settled gently over the village. The last glow of sunset faded from the hills. Stars appeared, bright and silver, scattered across the great dark sky like a handful of diamonds thrown onto velvet. The moon rose, round and golden, casting its soft light over the cottage, the garden, the sleeping meadow, and the distant hills where the fallen beanstalk have long since crumbled into the earth, returning to the soil from which it had so miraculously grown. Inside the cottage, the fire burned low, casting warm shadows on the walls. The golden hen tucked her head under her wing and slept. Milky White stood in the meadow, still as a statue, bathed in moonlight. Jack's mother rocked gently in her chair, her eyes closed, a peaceful smile on her lips. And Jack lay in his little bed under the eaves, looking out the window at the stars. And for once, he was not dreaming of faraway places. He was thinking about how lucky he was to be exactly where he was. The wind whispered through the garden. The stars twinkled softly, and the world was gentle and kind and full of quiet magic. Good night, little one. Sweet dreams. And that is the end of our story. Thank you for listening to GoReadling Bedtime Stories. Visit GoReadling.com for more stories, reading adventures, and fun learning for kids. Sweet dreams, little one. Good night.